Hello and welcome to another exciting lecture for biopsychology. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about evolutionary theory. So the learning objectives we're going to first look at defining evolution, both in general and in living things. Then we're going to look at identifying what concepts Darwin wanted to explain, explaining the three components of evolution by natural selection, analyzing the common misunderstandings in evolutionary theory, and explaining the differences between sexual selection and natural selection. Then we're going to get on the bio side and describe the basics of genes, look at ultimate and proximal causes of behavior, explain the mechanism of epigenetics, and looking at explaining behavioral genetics, heritability, and concordances. So now we have to ask the question, what is evolution? And if I had you in class, I'd ask you all to give me your opinion on what is evolution. And here's the thing, evolution just refers to change over time. So most people confuse evolution with evolution in living things. And now we're going to get in just a minute to evolution in living things, but when we just use the term evolution. We have to boil that down to just change over time. That's why you can have evolution in politics. You can have evolution in how things are manufactured, stuff like that. Evolution doesn't have to just refer to living things, even though that's the way we've come to commonly associate it with. Now, let's look instead at evolution in living things. So evolution in living things refers to the change over time in the structures of living things. So even scientists before Darwin, thousands of years ago, people knew that evolution occurred in living things. You can go back to times of Aristotle and look at the writings then and see that many of the popular philosophers even acknowledge that living things changed over time. It isn't that evolution occurs in living things that was really up for debate. It was how that change over time occurred. And this is where I also say I have to put out there that evolution is not concerned with the origin of life. That is more chemistry, physics, that domain, or metaphysics if you want to get into it. But evolution is referring to the change in structures over time. So there you do get the origin of species, not the origin of life, the origin of species, how species evolve from other species. Now, as I said, many geologists, embryologists, even philosophers, biologists believed at the time that evolution occurred. One of those popular theories, one of the most popular theories prior to Darwin, was Lamarckian evolution. So Lamarck basically said that individuals inherited characteristics from their parents, but he had a big emphasis on acquired characteristics. So characteristics that people acquire in their lifetime, that is what they pass on to their children. So looking at it, you see up here on the right where you get this Lamarck's giraffe. So his basic view of evolution was that you had this giraffe here. This giraffe stretched its neck more, and then through that stretching, the neck became progressively longer, and that was then passed on to the offspring through the giraffe straining and stretching its neck. That was passed on to the offspring. However, we now know, and even at the time they generally knew, that most acquired characteristics are not passed on. So Lamarckian evolution didn't work. However, he was on the right track. He was on the right track because there is this concept of characteristics being passed on, just not acquired characteristics. So characteristics of the parents are passed on. So along came Darwin, and he really liked Lamarck's theory, but he did think it was incorrect in scope, and he did think that the mechanism for it, that an individual, whatever changes they had in their lifespan, they passed on to their offspring, he thought that mechanism was incorrect. So what he wanted to do, he wanted to explain that mechanism. What mechanism is it that was causing evolutionary change? He also wanted to know why there was purposeful structures, so the existence of purposeful structures. The eyeball is a good example. We have a purposeful structure. It's a structure that's designed to see in a certain way. So how do eyeballs come about within evolution? And finally, he was also interested in the origin of species. So how did species originate? How did species come to evolve out of other species? Now, this is where I'd show you a video. Darwin himself, he was a third generation physician. So his father was a physician, his grandfather was a physician. So it was very bio heavy. He grew up in an environment where he learned about biological structures of people. His father was also a horse breeder, so he got some knowledge there about breeding of horses, breeding of animals. But when Darwin went to go to school to be a physician, he basically couldn't stand the sight of blood. His first surgery, he went in, and you got to remember at the time that there wasn't painkillers, you didn't put people under when you did surgeries. So the people are writhing on the table as they're tied down, being cut open for surgeries, and Darwin just couldn't stand it. And the first surgery he went into to watch, he fled it, and he vowed never to become a physician himself. He went back to school for seminary, decided that wasn't really for him. Then he went back to school again for switch to a geology related field, and along those lines he was interested in insects and things like that. There was a big overlap between geology and biology. So he had this just a general sense of interest in science. Also at the time, you had a very big division in class structure. So people from certain classes were not expected to interact with people from other classes. And I mean, it's something now we look back on and frown on, but it was common at the time. So there was a ship's captain he was basically tasked with charting the coast of South America. So wanted to map the coast of South America. And in England at the time had to sail over and map that coast. Well, again, there was this class structure in place, so the captain really wasn't allowed to interact with the crew of the ship. So captains at the time would hire on naturalists, scientists, things like that, people who came from a similar class as themselves, but weren't necessarily part of the crew, to be part of sea voyages, so the captain would have someone to socialize with. And there was this ship, the HMS Beagle, that was tasked again, like I said before, with charting the coast of South America. The captain hired on Darwin as a naturalist to basically be his social companion during this voyage. Darwin's also had a job. He would do things like go on shore and chart some of the things he found, like skeletons and animals, and basically different things that he found from that. Darwin found lots of things during this voyage, but the key came when they got to the Galapagos, which is off from the western coast of northern South America. And the Galapagos are a series of islands, and on these islands he found some very interesting things. Like he found birds that looked very different from each other, that were on different, each island had distinct species of birds, each island had distinct species of tortoises, and really this was like this first clue. So changing slides, Darwin got to some clues to evolution. One of the first ones, clues, was that those finches that I just talked about. So Darwin's famous finches, basically Darwin brought back in individuals from each of these different species of finches. He thought they were completely different species of birds, not related at all. They didn't look much alike. You see pictures of 4 of them in the top right up here. So these really didn't look much alike. And he went to a biologist who specialized in birds, and this biologist told him these were all different species of finch. So they were actually related. They were just different species. They looked different, but they were all different types of finches. So these are different species that had a common ancestor. They had some common ancestor. But what was it that caused them to differentiate? And he thought back to these different islands, and each of these different islands had different habitats. They had different, some had nuts, they had more nuts and seeds that were hard, and they required this big beak to break into. Some had flowers, and they to get the stuff out of the flowers, it required longer beaks to get into. So what he found is that the islands that had those flowers, it had the birds like what you see in the bottom right, whereas the islands that had nuts and seeds, it was like the ones on the top left. So each different species of finch was adapted to the environment on the island he found them on. Darwin also, again, like I said, his father was a horse breeder. He knew from horse breeding, and breeders have known for, again, thousands of years that some characteristics from parents are passed on to offspring. If you have a characteristic that you like in the species you want, and you find that characteristic in an individual, you breed that individual because their offspring are more likely to have that characteristic. So again, you've got this great variation going on that he found out in the finches. You've got characteristics passed on to offspring. And the last thing, the last key component that came along was he read some work by Malthus. And Malthus had said that more organisms are produced than can survive. There's a struggle for existence. Darwin actually did some math here and found out that if a female elephant began reproducing at the age of 30 and had 1 calf every only 10 years, so having 6 calves in total, over 500 years later, she would have 15 million descendants. By the fact that we know the world isn't overrun by elephants. The world isn't overrun by any species. If we looked at it in species that reproduce faster or have more offspring, it would be even crazier. You look at a spider that has lays hundreds of eggs. If every one of those eggs turned into an adult spider that laid hundreds of eggs, within just a dozen years, the world would just be completely overrun with spiders. So there is this struggle for existence along the lines of more offspring are produced than can survive. And these 3 things come together. So let's talk about evolution by natural selection now. So evolution by natural selection, you have variability that exists, variance. That is that variability that Darwin found. I talked on the previous slide about variability between different species, but even within individuals there's variability. 2 different individuals, unless they're identical twins, are not going to be identical. So there is variability between different individuals. If 2 different birds, one has a slightly longer beak than the other, and one has a slightly shorter, and to get food, the one that's got a slightly longer beak is going to be able to get more food, then that's going to be an advantage. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but the first key step is that variability exists. The next is heredity, that variability is passed on from parents to offspring. It's not acquired variability, even though there's a little bit of that going on, but that's beyond the scope of what we're going to get to. We're not going to really talk about epigenetics in here, but typically variability is only passed on that is part of genetic code, not acquired variability. But variability that you have, these characteristics that you have from birth, from your genes, can be passed on. So heredity. And then finally, some variants survive and reproduce better than others. That is selection. This is where I was just kind of getting ahead of myself talking about birds. That bird that had the slightly longer beak, so the variance, that variance allows them to survive and reproduce better than others. So the one with the slightly longer beak can survive better than the one with the shorter beak. Therefore, that they're more likely to survive, then they are more likely to pass on those genes of having a longer beak, passing on that through heredity. So when all three conditions are met, some variants increase in frequency and some decrease in frequency, depending on whether they help aid in survival and reproduction better. The variants that tend to aid in survival and reproduction increase in frequency. The ones that hinder survival and reproduction decrease in frequency. And when all three of these come together, the change in frequency of particular variants in a population due to inheritance and selection is called evolution by natural selection. Long way to say evolution by natural selection is basically where characteristics, inherited characteristics that aid in survival, aid in reproduction, increase in frequency. Ones that hinder or don't aid as well as others decrease in frequency. This is the short version of evolution by natural selection. This is one of those concepts that is very easy to just explain briefly, but is very complex and has many things that go into it and is a very difficult concept to master. And another thing I'll just say real quick here, because one of the things, and I actually will come back to this at times, but one of the things that I always like to talk about when I'm talking about evolution by natural selection, and that is we've got survive and we've got reproduce. We've got two different things here when we're talking about evolution by natural selection. We've got survive and reproduce. One of these is actually more important than the other. And it's not the one most people think. Most people think survival is more important, but it's actually reproduction that's more important. Survival is still important. Don't get me wrong there. Don't misquote me. Survival is still very important when it comes to evolution. But actually what's more important is reproduction. An individual that survives for 1,000,000 years but never reproduces is never going to have heredity. They're never going to pass on their genes. Therefore, evolution by natural selection doesn't work on them. An individual that only survives for 1 hour but reproduces, and reproduces well, then evolution is working on them. So in that case, reproduction is what's important. Survival is important to the extent that it gets you to reproduction. But reproduction is what's important, the most important when it comes to evolution by natural selection. And that's why we'll come back to later. We'll talk about one of the subcategories of evolution, which is called sexual selection, and why that's such a big deal and why that became so prevalent, and why before Darwin came up with sexual selection, it actually his theory had holes in it, and that is what filled the holes in. So if I ever ask you a question, what's more important, survival or reproduction, when it comes to evolution by natural selection, it's reproduction. And that's why when you hear that term survival of the fittest, it makes evolutionary theorists just want to facepalm, because it's not about survival as much as it is about reproduction. Should be reproduction of the fittest if you want to say anything, but that's even bad and cringy. So okay, now let's transition into some of the common misunderstandings about evolutionary theory. I'm not going to harp on this too much. I just want to talk about them briefly. One of the big things that's typically said is that when we talk about evolution, we're talking biological side, and then if we're talking that, then we say that the environment's unimportant, that behavior is genetically determined. And I'm not getting into determinism versus free will. I'm just getting into genes versus environment. And I've already said earlier in a previous set of slides that they're both important. But let's look here, because some people say that by following evolutionary theory, somebody is saying that the environment's unimportant. Well, that's not true. Evolutionary theory is a very interactionist theory. It's a very interactionist framework. That is that both the genes, these genetically based predispositions and adaptations, and environment, the environmental triggers, are what's important. You see two things here on this slide. On the left, you've got calluses. This is where, again, genes and environment are important. These calluses that you have here and all over the hands, they are important because, both the genes and environment are important because this person, and just about everyone, have a genetic predisposition, a genetic code to form calluses, but it takes environmental triggers like working with your hands, weightlifting, doing a sport with your hands, digging, stuff like that. It takes working with your hands for these calluses to form. So it's an interaction between the genes and the environment. Over on the right here, you see the tan. The tan and skin tone in general is, there is a genetic predisposition to have a skin tone. You're genetically predisposed to have a skin tone that's within a range, but then you need the environment, the exposure to the sun or lack of exposure to the sun, to get specific skin tone that you have. And I'll come back to it on the next slide, even that with the sunscreen that's being applied. Okay, next slide is related to the first one. The first one is that if it's determinism. The next, or biological determinism in such a sense. The next one is if it's evolutionary, we can't change it. Well, since the genes and environment interact, we can change our outcomes, our behaviors, our responses by altering the environment. So you see here on the left, a hand without calluses. That is because this individual didn't do things that would have resulted in calluses. The same with the previous one. If you want calluses, you do things that result in calluses, and you can get calluses. Over here on the right, you see an individual that has pale skin. The pale skin is a result of either sunscreen or staying out of the sun. So the skin, again, as pale as it is, you still have a genetic limits, upper and lower limits of skin tone, which we'll actually talk about in a couple more slides. But you have some genetic limits on skin tone, but you can manipulate that by manipulating the environment you're in, such as using sunscreen or staying out of the sun to be paler, or going out in the sun using less sunscreen to be darker. And what it comes down to here, and I love this concept, and it's why I'm such a strong proponent of evolutionary theory and why I teach it in just about every class I teach, because the better we understand our evolved psychological mechanisms and how they interact with the environment, the greater our power to create desirable outcomes in humans. And this works in behaviors, in all different things. This is how we can reduce things like racism, by better understanding the mechanisms that we have in our head, these predispositions that we have based on biology and genes, and how they interact with the environment, the better we can control and reduce adverse behaviors like racism and increase beneficial behaviors like helping and charity. Next one, and I'm going to talk about this one for a little while, and that is the current mechanisms are optimally designed. This is a misunderstanding, a misconception. What we actually know is that no, our current mechanisms, what they actually represent is adaptations to past environments. So our current environment, if it differs substantially, not always, but if it differs substantially from our previous ones, these mechanisms we have aren't necessarily going to be useful anymore. And I'll even come into and talk about some of these, how it might not even be due to environmental mismatch, but it might be due to other reasons. So this is A of the, we're going to have three different things we're optimally designed. So A, our mechanisms are not optimally designed because of what's called environmental mismatch. There's a term called EEA, that's our error of environmental adaptiveness. You don't have to know that or memorize it, just know that the EEA is when behaviors evolved. So these behaviors didn't evolve in the last week, the last month, the last year, even the last few generations. They're continually evolving over generations, but most of the behaviors we have evolved over the last few 100,000 to few million years. So these are behaviors that evolved in a environment that is very different than our rapidly changing modern environment that involves cities and technology and electronics that weren't around when these behaviors evolved. So we get a couple things that's going on here, and you kind of see what I'm talking about on the bottom right, where you have original environment, that's where the trait, it may be neutral or advantageous. The environment changes and we get a mismatch in, so sometimes you'll get behaviors that'll decline after that, but it's not something that happens overnight. So let's look at two of these pictures here. The one on the left is the one I love the most. It's the one I always talk about, and that's candy, sugar. There's a very big environmental mismatch going on there. That is that when our desire to eat sugars and carbs evolved, it was in an environment that was very different than the environment we're in now. It was when we were in an environment where there wasn't readily available large quantities of sugars and carbs like there is now. So we evolved this, humans evolved this desire, strong desire for sugars, because sugars would have been beneficial. When you could get sugar, when you could get these carby foods, high carb foods, you would want to eat them because they would have been high calorie. They would have been very beneficial in an environment where food might have been scarce. However, we're in an environment now where you can go down to the corner store and get sugar, get candy, and as a result, you can, this strong desire for sugar, if we listen to this strong desire over and over again, we end up being obese, we end up getting diabetes, we end up with adverse outcomes. So this environmental mismatch between when we evolved our desire for sugar and our modern environment where sugar is everywhere results in adverse mechanisms, adverse adaptations. On the right here you see aggression. Aggression is one of those. Again, we got an environmental mismatch. In our evolutionary past, it might have been beneficial to be aggressive. Being more aggressive might have gained resources, might have gained opportunities for reproduction, those types of things. Whereas in our modern environment, aggression is basically morally frowned upon. So acts of aggression now actually typically have the opposite effect. So we evolved the mechanisms for aggression in an environment where it was beneficial, and we continue to be aggressive even now in an environment where it is detrimental. Okay, so let's look at the second for current mechanisms are optimally designed. That is not all that we should look at. Then again, it's the misconception that current mechanisms are optimally designed because they're not optimally designed. The second evidence for that is that all adaptations have costs, so not all features can be optimized. On the left here you see a book called Living Color. It's by Nina Jablonski. She is an anthropologist from Penn State University that studies basically the evolution of skin color and then the social and biological meanings of that. But what it comes down to here is that because mechanisms, any adaptation we have, it's a better way to say it, any adaptation we have is going to have costs and benefits. Very few adaptations just come with benefits. Very few adaptations that are selected for come with just benefits. They come with costs as well. And the reason I am talking about skin tone here is because skin tone is a very good example of that. That is that skin tone, darker skin tone specifically, has a very big advantage. That very big advantage is it protects us from the sun. The sun has harmful light that causes cancer, and by having a darker skin tone, it reduces your chances of getting cancer from the sun. So it is very beneficial, and you see this in example here in the girl on the left. She has very dark skin. She's going to have a lower chance of getting cancer from being out in the sun. So there are benefits to dark skin tone. However, there are costs to dark skin tone. And we'll go conversely with the light skin tone in just a second. But there are costs to dark skin tone. That is that we need vitamin D to survive, and we get vitamin D by the sun. From basically we absorb it from the sun. However, the darker skin tone makes it harder to absorb the vitamin D. So you get the benefit of lower cancer as well as some other benefits, and the main cost of lower vitamin D absorption. The girl on the right here, she gets the benefit of greater vitamin D absorption, but the cost of greater risk of cancer. So we then have to ask, well, why don't we all have darker colored skin? Why don't we all have lighter colored skin? Why is there variance in color of skin? And that is because these different skin tones evolved in environments where it would have been beneficial to have one skin tone or the other. The girl on the left, this is from an evolved environment where there was lots of sun, large quantities of sun. And even large quantities of sun, even with darker skin tone, you can still absorb vitamin D by being in the sun more. So in environments where there's more sun, closer to the equator, more environments where there's less trees, where there's less clouds, where there's just more time in the sun, you're going to get this, like on the left, darker skin tone. Whereas environments farther from the equator, where there is less sun, where there is less opportunity to absorb vitamin D, or less opportunity to absorb vitamin D because there's less time in the sun, you get these lighter skin tones. Like you see here, and typically you get in the environments where this red hair, green eyes evolved, is Northern Europe, or where you get the light skin, blonde hair. So you get Ireland, Northern Europe, places like that where they have less time in the sun. There's jokes about Ireland that you never see this, or the 3 days you see the sun, because it's just always overcast. As well as, if you ever look at a map, Ireland is way north in the grand scheme of things, so they just have less daylight in general. So you get these benefits and costs and the environments that they evolve in as a result. However, now we go back to that environmental mismatch we were talking about, because now we have people being able to travel. So we have people with darker skin in environments where lighter skin would be more beneficial. We have people with lighter skin in environments where darker skin would be more beneficial. We have both in environments where we're inside all the time. So that's an environmental mismatch there. It's where these costs and benefits of different features, there's costs and benefits, so we evolve where costs and benefits would be optimized, and now we have an environmental mismatch on top of that. Yeah, now let's get to the third one. That is that natural selection does not have foresight. So see here, natural selection doesn't have foresight, so because of that, it often just finds the best solution to a problem given the options it has. And there's two things going on with this one. First off, it finds the best solution to a problem based on the alternatives it has. So because of that, it can't create adaptations. It can't create variance that doesn't exist. So even if the optimal, the ideal mechanism would be one thing, if evolution never gives it the option or the opportunity to go in that direction, then it's never going to go in that direction. The other thing is the foresight problem here, and that is that evolution is evolving for the current environment, not for the future environment. It doesn't give an organism what it needs to survive. It gives an organism what was useful for survival when that behavior evolved. Let's look at a couple examples of that. First is the human eye, and not just the human eye, the vertebrate eye. So the vertebrate eye, all vertebrates, all things with backbones have this type of eye. Some of them have variations on it, some of them have lost it, but basically all things with backbones have this eye, and that is the eye that we have as humans is basically inside out. The optic nerve leaves the eye, and where it leaves the eye, there's a hole. What that ends up resulting in is a blind spot. So some animals have bigger blind spots than others. In humans, we have a blind spot off to the side. It's not that big of a deal, but it is a blind spot that exists. Why has that blind spot not been selected out in vertebrates? And mainly because, again, it's giving vertebrates, any individual, the best of possible alternatives, and it hasn't been selected out because no better alternative has been presented. However, in the eyes of some mollusks like squids and octopus, which you find, or octopi, octopuses, octopi, both are technically correct. What you find is that the retina is in front of the optic nerve and they don't have a blind spot. So when the eye evolved in these mollusks, it evolved without this blind spot present. And because it hasn't been detrimental enough to be selected against in invertebrates, plus a better thing hasn't come along, you find that it stays in vertebrates. The eye is interesting. There's 8 or 9 different unique evolutions of the eye that have been found in different animals throughout history. So it's one of those that there is definitely different versions out there. But because mechanisms they have to deal with what they're given, that it's the vertebrate eye, even though it's not optimal, is the eye we have. The second example I'm going to give here, and this is the last example I'll give for this, and then I'll move on to sexual selection, is the recurrent laryngeal nerve. This is a fun one. So this is a nerve that supplies motor function and sensation to the larynx or the voice box. So what it does is it descends from the back of the brain here to the throat here. However, it goes all the way down around the aortic arch. So it goes all the way down below the aortic arch before it comes back up. And what is going on here? Well, actually, in fish, one of our ancestors, or the fish that have a common ancestor as us, but are closer to the common ancestor in morphology, in fish, this nerve goes like this. That's because the aortic arch that you see here in this aortic arch is actually up here. So in fish, It still goes around the aortic arch. It just is this nerve is a very short nerve. In mammals, where the chest cavity evolved and descended down from the throat, and this aortic arch descended into the chest cavity, the nerve that went around this, it again, best the best mechanism, the best variation available was just to continue to go around the aortic arch. There wasn't any variations that evolved that it went straight between, so it continued to go on down around the aortic arch as things evolved longer. This is even more absurd when you look at vertebrates with long necks, like giraffe here, where it comes all the way down and back up, or even when we look at some things like the brontosaurus, where it went all the way down like this and all the way back up. This is definitely not optimally designed. Optimally designed would have been this tiny little thing right there in blue. Instead, it went all the way down in the chest cavity and all the way back up. The way I equate this is it's like driving from Detroit to Ann Arbor by way of Toledo. So you see the red line is Detroit to Ann Arbor, but instead going down through Toledo first. So, and again, why is this occurring? It's occurring because there wasn't a variant that existed where, or at least a variant that existed where it was beneficial enough to be selected for. So there's a lot that goes into evolution. There's a lot of misconceptions out there. And if you're interested, and those that are bio majors, you've heard all this before, but if you're interested, I really strongly suggest looking into it. It's some really interesting stuff. All right, the last thing I'm going to talk about, these slides ended up longer than I intended. Anytime I get talking about evolution, I get long-winded and talk longer than I intended. I just want to bring up sexual selection. So the reason I bring this up is because prior to sexual selection, Darwin actually had nightmares about the peacock's tail. That is because the peacock's tail really goes against evolution by natural selection. That is, the peacock's tail is not something that benefits it in survival specifically. I'll come back to the why I'm leaving out reproduction in a second, but the peacock's tail does not aid it in survival. It's vulnerable to parasites. Predators will latch onto it and catch the bird as a result. So it's just one of those things that it's really a hindrance to survival. And prior to coming up with sexual selection, which happened about 15 years after Darwin came up with natural selection, Darwin was focused on survival as the mechanism. But what really kind of brought evolution by natural selection together into the cohesive theory we have today is the advent of sexual selection. And that is that anything that aids or gives an advantage to an individual over others in exclusive relation to reproduction, even if it has a cost in survival, will be selected for. So this is kind of where going back to where that survival and reproduction, where reproduction is more important. So the peacock's tail, the reason the peacock's tail is selected for is because it aids the peacock in reproduction, even if it imposes a survival cost. And actually one of the reasons it aids it in reproduction is because it imposes a survival cost. It's something that signals to a peahen, a female, that even though he's got this giant tail, he still is able to survive and resist parasites and survive predators. So because he's able to survive, he's strong enough to survive, then his offspring will be strong enough to survive as well. There's more that goes into it than that, but that's the basics of it. Those three conditions of natural selection still must be met. There must be variance, there must be heredity, and there must be selection. It's just that in sexual selection, the variance that increase reproduction, even if they hinder survival, are selected for because they are variants that will get them selected for reproduction. Next thing we'll talk about is genes and genetics. So, as far as the precursor to genes goes, before we get to actual genes and the basics of it, I want to talk about the precursors of biology when it comes to genes. So, we've got genetic information. Our brain and our body develop according to these complex chemical instructions that are written into the human cells. And how is that made up of? Well, during fertilization, when the basically when the sperm meets the ovum and a zygote is formed. A zygote is I'll even bring that up. A zygote is a cell that results when an egg is fertilized. Prior to that, there's 23 chromosomes in the father's sperm, and there's 23 chromosomes in the mother's egg. Humans are made up of 23 pairs of chromosomes. But prior to it, in the sex cells, like the sperm and the egg, there's 23 individual chromosomes in each. When fertilization occurs, those 23 individual sets of chromosomes pair together to become 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs. But what are chromosomes? Chromosomes are rod-like structures that contain within them DNA, tightly coiled strands of DNA. And DNA is that genetic information. That genetic information that makes up our development, that makes up who we are, how we do many of the things we do, is made up of or controlled by DNA. And again, DNA is on chromosomes. We'll talk just a minute on the next slide about genes, but genes are basically pieces of the chromosomes or pieces of the DNA. So we'll talk about that in just a minute, but how this is made up of is these chromosomes are made up, you have 23 pairs of chromosomes, you get 23 from each parent, and that composes our DNA. So DNA itself, so this is describe the basics of genes. So we're getting to this. We've got our DNA is basically a ladder. It's made up of 4 chemical base pairs. Genes, on the other hand, and just talk about real quick, you've got these base pairs. We're not going to go into too much of it, but A, C, T, and G, you can take a bio class to do more of that, or bio psych to get more of that. But the point is, the whole point, what is going on with DNA, is that this DNA will split apart temporarily. We will have amino acids that will bind to this split apart DNA, and it will form proteins. And these proteins that are formed, and they break off from that, and then the DNA comes back together. But these proteins that are formed basically shape what makes us up, what makes up us. That's the easiest way to explain it. So the genes are specific segments that contain the instructions for making those proteins. And as I already said, proteins are those chemical building blocks from which all the parts of the brain, body, all of that is constructed. So proteins make us up. Genes are the instructions for making the proteins, and genes are segments of DNA. So if you want to talk about the basics of genes, they are segments of DNA. Now, when you are born, when that sperm meets the ovum and you get a zygote, the resulting fusion of those 23 pairs of chromosomes results in you will get specific genes. You will get some genes from your mother, you will get some genes from your father, you will get some genes that are actually a combination of the two, and you will get some genes due to things like mutations that are from neither your mother or your father. In these genes, you will come in, or basically for all of the different things that make us who we are, things that do commands for proteins. For all the different proteins, for all the different commands to make up our brain and our body, you'll have different genes. And when you're talking about genes, there is specific what are called, and I don't think I'm going to talk about these in the next slide, so we'll talk about alleles here. You have specific alleles. These are specific genes to you. Now, you're going to have an allele for a gene, or an allele for a specific, let's say, behavior or characteristic. Let's say you've got an allele that's for just one gene, it has an allele for how tall you're going to be. Now there are many different genes that dictate how tall you are, but let's say there's only one gene that dictates how tall you are. You will have an allele for height, and you will get an allele basically from your mother, you'll get an allele from your father, and we'll talk about on the next slide how you can have, it can be, if one's dominant, one's recessive, all of that. We'll get to that on the next slide. I don't want to confuse you too much here, but the point is whatever is expressed is what your results will be. And different people will have different alleles, will have different genes that are giving those instructions. And that's what we'll get to when we talk about evolution, and how all evolution is based on is this right here, and allele or gene frequencies, how they will increase or decrease in frequency in a population. Let's get to that dominant and recessive though. So you've got those genes. I've been using the term alleles, and that's what you'll see over here on the right where it says alleles. But you've got these genes. A dominant gene, it doesn't matter if it's paired with itself or a recessive gene, a dominant gene will become the expressed trait if you have it. So let's say you've got we're talking about height, and again, it's not, there's not a single gene that influences height, but let's say there was. You've got a dominant gene for being 5'10", and you've got a recessive gene for being 5'6". That dominant gene, the 5'10", is what will be expressed. Now, we're again ignoring environment here, which has factors on height as well, and we're ignoring the fact that this is polygenetic, meaning that more than one gene influences it. We're just saying in the case of one gene, if you had a gene for 5'10", to be 5'10", and a gene for 5'6", and the gene for 5'10" was dominant, then you'd be 5'10". However, if you've got a recessive gene and it's paired with another recessive gene, then the recessive gene will be what is expressed. So if you've got both recessive genes for 5'6", then you'll be 5'6" yourself. There's also special cases which are referred to as incomplete dominance. Incomplete dominance is when you mix the traits from both parents. Incomplete dominance is relatively rare when it comes to genetics. It does occur, but usually you've got this dominant or recessive. You don't have this incomplete. Incomplete is where you mix the two. So if you had a gene from one parent to be 5'10" and another to be 5'6", and incomplete dominance occurred, you'd be 5'8", or roughly in between, somewhere in between, because it's an incomplete dominance that occurs. And this is where you see on the right where, let's say it was a single gene to have blue eyes, and both of your parents have brown eyes, but they have the recessive gene for blue eyes. So dominant for brown, recessive for blue, dominant for brown, recessive for blue. Then you've got a 25% chance of getting an AA and having brown, a 25% or a 50% chance of getting both alleles, but because brown is dominant, you'll have brown eyes, and you have a 25% chance of getting both recessive genes and having blue eyes. So there's still a chance. Now, that's not exactly the way eye color works, and there's more to it than that. It's always, when we talk about biology, we have to say, okay, here's a really easy example for something that is in actuality or in fact very complex. Because very rarely do we just say there's one gene that causes this, or very rarely is it a normal, dominant versus recessive that we're talking about. Because for some genes, we've been talking about a recessive and a dominant allele, but for some genes, there can be 10, 15 different alleles, and these 10 to 15 different alleles come in different, basically, categories. And a allele that might be recessive to a different allele that's dominant might actually be dominant to a different recessive allele. So it's the actuality is it's much fuzzier than this, but this is the easy way to explain it so that you at least get an understanding of the overview of what is the basics of genes and genetics. So we shouldn't talk about evolution without at least examining the nature versus nurture argument. So the nature versus nurture argument basically says that on the nature side of things, that the influence on physical and mental traits as well as behavior is caused by genetics and biology. It's basically just caused by our genes. And then the nurture side is that our behavior, our physical and mental traits, all of those are caused by our experiences. So we've got on one side, we've got genetics, genes, and on the other side, we've got our experiences or our environment. And that's one of the things that historically there's been an argument about what has more of an influence, nature or nurture. Does nature everything? Is nurture everything? Is it all bio? Is it all learning behavior? And it was a heated argument for a long time. But you should basically look at this as these are interconnected. Nature and nurture are both responsible. You have these biological predispositions that are nature. But then you have the environment that you're in, which relates to it. So that's nurture. And when we're talking about these, we can actually look at these as how they influence causes of behavior. So proximal and ultimate causes. An ultimate cause is the underlying reason of why a behavior exists or what a behavior is. So that's the ultimate cause. The proximal cause, however, is more of the environmental reason for the behavior existing. So we might have aggression. Why do we have aggression? Well, you could look at it from the ultimate cause perspective. We have aggression because testosterone relates to decision making, which relates to basically raising of our blood pressure, which relates to aggression. Okay, now we've got that ultimate cause. We've got the biological cause. But we've also got why do we have that? Why do we have that biological cause of aggression? What is the purpose of it? And the purpose of it is, at least historically in humans, aggression was to gain resources, to gain something, or to prevent the loss of something. So there is a environmental reason for aggression, and then there is a biological cause that leads to that biological or to that environmental reason for aggression. This gets us to epigenetics. So we've been mainly talking about things and how the direct effects of genetics, and I mentioned epigenetics in passing, but now let's look at epigenetics as how or what is going on with epigenetics. So epigenetics is the study of how experiences and behaviors influence the expression of genes. Basically, epigenetics is looking at how our environment and environmental factors actually affect genetic expression and how this genetic expression can actually be passed down. So when we were talking earlier about Lamarckian evolution and how acquired characteristics during our lifetime, how something like that can then be passed on, and how typically things that are acquired during our life are not passed on. But this is one case where things that are acquired during our life are passed on. So I kind of explained it already, But how epigenetics works is basically relating to, it doesn't change the genes themselves, it doesn't change our DNA itself, it just changes how our DNA is coiled, or the structure of the DNA. So it doesn't change our AC, T's, and G's at all, it just changes the actual coiling of it. And you'll recall I talked about how the DNA splits apart, and the molecules then bind to that, amino acids then bind to that, those amino acids form proteins, those proteins are the building block of everything that makes up who we are. That's good. Now we've got to talk about, though, what is related to that. And if the point is that for it to split apart and amino acids to bind to it, the DNA has to be wound a specific way. It has to be bound loose enough that it can split apart and amino acids can bind to it. If it's wound too tight, it can't split apart, or at least it can't split apart far enough for amino acids to bind to it. Proteins don't bind to it, or proteins aren't formed. You don't then get actual proteins from that section of the DNA. And that's how epigenetics works, is not changes in the A, C, T, and G of DNA, it's changes in the winding of the DNA that allows for transcription to occur. So methyl groups, they can cause DNA to become unwound, or sorry, to be wound too tightly. The opposite of that. They can cause DNA to be wound too tightly, and this prevents transcription. The DNA is wound so tight that it can't split apart, amino acids can't bind to it, proteins aren't formed. That section of DNA basically becomes inactive. Acetyl groups, though, can actually loosen DNA, and this section allows for transcription. So if you're born with some sections of your DNA coiled too tightly, environmental things can happen and our DNA can basically be loosened up. And now you're expressing something your parents haven't expressed. Or the opposite is true. You could have a region that's unwound or loose and it gets wound too tightly. And now that isn't transcribing. And now you're different than your parents again in another way. That environment has changed. The point is, though, is these changes don't just affect you. These changes are passed on to your offspring. And they can be passed on through multiple generations. An example is a town that kept excellent records of health, birth, and death. And after years of feast and famine, during periods of time when there's a lot of available resources and periods of time when there wasn't a lot of resources, during those periods of time when there wasn't a lot of resources, their descendants had less heart disease and diabetes. Because, again, during the period of famine, these things are happening. Some of it's being wound more tightly, some of it's being loosening, causing epigenetic changes. Those epigenetic changes were then passed on to children. Their children then had less things like heart disease and diabetes as a result. And we've got other documented cases like this, but this is one of those clear-cut things where we can see what happened to one generation actually affects the next generation. So real quickly here, we'll just talk about genetic testing, because this allows us to get into some of the topics we're going to talk about in just a minute. But we can do genetic testing on fetuses now. You can blood test the mother early in the pregnancy to determine if there's genetic disorders in the fetus. You can then determine if they've got genetic deficiencies. You can do carrier testing, where you can test both parents to see if they're carriers of recessive alleles for disorders. You guys know I've talked about this a few times, but I've got dogs and I breed the dogs. All of the dogs that I would breed, I do carrier testing on them, and to make sure they don't have specific traits. The worst of the traits are dominant traits that would be passed on, but if they've got recessive traits, it's okay as long as they're not being mated with another dog that has those recessive traits. But as a responsible breeder, you do this genetic testing to make sure they don't have any disorders that could be passed on to the offspring. And then you're perpetuating these disorders. And that's one of the things you see in a lot of breeders that are basically unethical, is they are not doing this DNA testing, so they end up having a lot of these traits, that like blindness when the dog's young, even cerebral palsy, other things like that, hips that dislocate. All of these are things that are possible for there to be genetics for in dogs, and they don't get tested for, and you end up getting this perpetuating in the population. We do this in humans too, though. We can test to see if people are carriers for recessive alleles. We can test to see if a fetus has a genetic disorder. There's even, if in severe cases, where you've got two parents who are carriers of a really deleterious negative or recessive allele, they both are carriers, meaning if they're both carriers, there's a 25% chance that their kid will have that trait. So what they'll do is they'll do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. They'll fertilize several eggs in the lab, allow them to develop a little bit to the 8-cell stage, and test one of those 8 cells, and any of the embryos that do not have the disorder they'll implant, because they want to, again, get rid of that, or they want to make sure that their child doesn't have that genetic disorder. Which gets us to the topic of genetic engineering. So genetic engineering is changing DNA of an organism by creating, and through that, creating a genetically modified organism. We're not, we'll talk about in humans in just a second. But genetic engineering is something that has been going on for many, many years. It actually is quite common. Almost all of the plant food we eat comes from GMOs in one way or another. And this is the thing, that there's this pushback against GMOs, like GMOs are bad. Most GMOs that we have are actually good. There are things that help them grow better. Let's put it this way. If we did not have GMO corn, GMO corn specifically, if we did not have GMO corn and GMO grains, the amount of people going hungry and starving in the world would be way higher. Like, we're talking 1,000 times to 10,000 times higher than it is today. There are people still starving in the world. There are people going hungry. There are places in the world that aren't getting enough food. The only reason there are some places and not many places is because of GMOs. If we use non-GMO grains and corns, we would just not have enough grains and corns to feed the people on the planet. The point is GMOs have allowed us to have higher yields in smaller crop areas, and because of that, it's done the single biggest thing in history to reduce starvation and hunger. We can look at various different things, like CRISPR-Cas9, which is a relatively new way to accurately and easily change or alter DNA, which is why it's become so easy to change or to create GMOs. Transgenic organisms are ones that have genes inserted, changed, or removed. You see this where you get genes inserted from another organism. And yeah, we can think of horror stories from stuff like that, but the point is that if we can insert a gene that causes a crop yield to increase, that does not cause adverse effects other than just the increase in crop yield, then that's actually a benefit. There's knockout mice or rats or animal models or research that are where targeted genes are removed or disabled, so where they can test what genes are actually doing what. Since all mammals share about 97%, it's about 95 to 97% of genes are shared by all mammals. If we can identify the gene in a rat, or a mouse that does a specific thing or is related to a specific trait, then we can then modify it in humans if we need to, which gets us to talking about genetics in genetic engineering in humans. Before we fully talk about genetics engineering in humans, though, we have to look at what is going on. What would it be that we'd be controlling or changing? Well, behavioral genetics is the field of genetics that looks at our genetic influences on behavior. We can do this in animal models, but in humans, when we're looking at specifically human behaviors, things that are not expressed in non-human animals, especially non-human mammals or non-human primates, we do basically heritability and concordance rates. So heritability is a statistic looking at the proportion of variation that's due to genetics or the environment. And concordance is the probability that related people will develop specific disorders based on our heritability rates. And how do we do that? We do that through twin studies. Twin studies are really fun. So twin studies are studies where where people that are dizygotic and monozygotic twins, identical and fraternal twins, where they will measure characteristics, behavioral characteristics in these different twins. And they're looking at how how much more or how much greater the overlap is in identical twins than it is in fraternal twins. Because if it's more identical, then it is more likely to be, or if there's more overlap, it's more likely to be something that's genetic rather than environmental. And one of the things they also do is they look at both twins that are raised together and ones that are raised in different households so that they can then check for environmental factors as well. Now, there's an argument out there about how this doesn't fully do it because people who are adopting kids are going to end up sharing a lot of environmental influences there anyway. But even beyond that, we've got the fact that you're still going to have different environments there. So we look at things like height and weight. These are things that are much higher in identical twins than they are in fraternal twins. And they have pretty high correlations, pretty high heritability. That's because these are mainly genetic. Your height and your weight is mostly genetic. It's somewhat environmental, but it's mostly genetic. And then we get things that are much less genetic, but still have a genetic component like temperament, depressive episodes. They are much higher in identical twins than they are fraternal twins, even if their correlation, their heritability, is less than 50%, a little bit less than 50%, but still less than 50%, meaning there's a strong genetic component there, but even then, we're only looking at about 50% of it being genetic, 50% of it being environmental. So now that we understand that we can identify traits that do have genetic components, we just got done talking about genetic engineering. Let's look at eugenics. So eugenics is a harsh term. Eugenics is a term that we talk about. It's used more specifically as a term for controlled breeding. But eugenics is actually beyond that. And I don't want to redeem the term genetics. I'm not trying to redeem it. Eugenics is a negative term. However, eugenics can be considered to look at any time we're doing genetic engineering on humans of one form or another, whether we're doing genetic engineering on our DNA or we're doing genetic engineering by selective breeding. But now let's look at the selective breeding side, because we're not going to really get into that ethical side currently, where we look at is it ethical or not to do genetic engineering in humans. First off, I just want to say it's possible to do genetic engineering on humans. We're not talking about selective breeding here. We're talking about actually changing our DNA. Should we be doing it? If it's to reduce negative disorders, probably. Should we be doing it to change behavioral outcomes, to reduce aggression in humans, things like that? Probably not. But that's an ethical question. That is, basically, is there a ethical reason in humans to reduce aggression? We already talked about how aggression has an environmental mismatch, meaning we are in an environment where aggression is less allowed, but we evolved our aggression traits in an environment where aggression was more involved. Should we be trying to genetically modify humans to reduce aggression levels to our current environment? Because there is that environmental mismatch. We just talked about disorders and how it's actually okay to do it's possibly okay to do genetic engineering to remove disorders. Well, what do we classify as a disorder? We could easily say something like schizophrenia is a disorder. But what about aggression? Is aggression a disorder? Some people would say having too much aggression is a disorder. So if it's okay to genetically modify for something like that, now we're getting into the fuzziness. So I just want you to think about that. It is something that is really thought-provoking there. But let's actually look at the talks about breeding and eugenics looking at breeding. So positive eugenics, and again, positive and negative here doesn't mean good and bad. It means addition or allowing. Positive eugenics is promoting high reproduction in humans with good genes. There's financial incentives for it. There's fitter family contests. We actually see positive eugenics as something that occurs in just about every culture, even if it's not called eugenics. Then there's negative eugenics, on the other hand, and that's promoting the removal of bad genes from the population, such as genocide and sterilization. That's very definitely not okay. But where is the ethical line of positive eugenics being allowed? There are some times where we look at things, because again, a lot of societies do this. You get rewards like financial incentives for being smarter. And people who are more financially stable are more likely to then have children. But maybe not, because that's something that's changed of late. If you look at 100 years ago, that might have been the case. But now, maybe not the case. Because people who are actually more financially stable are more likely to use birth control. So they're actually having less children. And people who are less financially stable are having more children. So we're actually doing a reverse eugenics in such a way in that people who are more financially stable are having less kids, therefore they're passing on their genes less, therefore they're being selected out of the population. If you've ever seen the movie Idiocracy, where the whole comment that stupid people are breeding, we actually can look at that and say that there is some indications that with the current reproductive trends we have in the world, that may actually be the case. That people who are more intelligent, and we're relating intelligence here to not just to wealth, but there is a relationship, there is a small correlation between wealth and intelligence. So even if it's not a strong relationship, it is something that over time will start to show an effect, just like the other things we were talking about with natural selection, and how some of these things don't happen in a few generations. They happen in many, many, many generations, simply because it's a minor effect or a weak effect, but it does eventually happen. So it's looking at how we could be going in that direction. So let's get to a contemporary issue, optogenetics, which is a genetic engineering technique that splices in genes that produce photosensitive pigments that attach to neuron membrane ion channels. Basically, we can do a genetic engineering to make cells photoreceptive. or photosensitive. And we can then turn on and off neurons as a result of this. And one of the ways we've been able to use this in humans is to help with chronic pain and muscle movements and problems associated with things like Parkinson's. So it is something that we have been able to identify where it's a genetic engineering technique that doesn't get rid of Parkinson's, but it can help remove some of the issues of Parkinson's. So how does it work? It basically is a photopigment that is spliced into the DNA that opens up sodium ion channels when hit by blue light, basically increasing excitation, and it opens the chlorine channels when yellow light, causing inhibition, and basically it can look at or specifically work in regions of pain to when you put on blue light, it can reduce pain, or yellow light, it can reduce pain, depending on what we're splicing it to. There's a lot of different things it can then be spliced to that can then have these effects. Okay, this lecture got a little bit long, but it's a fun lecture. So we talked about evolution. We talked about defining it both in general and living things. We looked at identifying what concepts Darwin wanted to explain. Then we explained the three components of evolution by natural selection, analyzed the common misunderstandings in evolutionary theory, explained the differences between sexual and natural selection, then switched over to, again, the more bio side, describing the basics of genes, differentiating the ultimate and proximal causes of behavior, explaining the mechanism of epigenetics, and then looking here at the end, explaining behavioral genetics, heritability, concordance, and finished up with some talk about some things that are ethically relevant, should be ethically considered. Not ethically considered meaning we should be doing them, but we should consider the ethics of doing them when we are considering doing them. And that's things like epigenetics, and then into things like eugenics. Okay, thanks. Come on back.